Our keynote speech tonight is Jim Mars, and I'll read a short bio introduction about him. However, how many people know Jim Mars? Okay, that's like 2/3. That's the best response we've ever had for any sort of question so far. Yeah, that's 2/3. How many people know the name of the president? Everybody, hopefully. Dick Cheney was the answer. So, Ken, are you ready? Okay. All right. If we can have quiet or so, let me begin by introducing our keynote speech. Jim Mars is an award-winning Texas author and journalist. He has never hesitated to write about some of the greatest mysteries and controversies of our time. He is a distinguished journalist and author of best-selling books like Rule by Secrecy, Crossfire, and Alien Agenda. And I guess the latest one is Inside Job. Mr. Mars is a gifted writer, sleuth for the truth. He wrote the foreword to my book, Magic Eyes Only. And I'm sure that he just sort of sat down at his computer and banged through it once, and it was perfect.
I'm the truth fairy.
Truth fairy, okay. His 40-year experience in investigative journalism is a powerful discriminant for fact versus fiction. And one of my goals is I'd love to have 10 investigative journalists here today that are studying in college to dive into any one of these crash retrievals or any one of these mysteries related and pursue it with rigor. And I'm sure they would find it fascinating and interesting. He's appeared on hundreds of national and regional TV and radio programs, including This Morning America, Geraldo, Montel Williams, Today, Good Morning Texas. Good Morning Texas. Okay, wait a second. It says it's a typo. Wait a second. I thought Texas was its own state, our own country, right? It is, right? Okay. Right. Okay. Larry King and Art Bell radio shows. A former president of the Press Club of Fort Worth and a current member of the Society of Professional Journalists, Sigma Delta Chi, another secret society, no doubt. And investigative reporters and editors, Mars has spoken out on a variety of conspiracy topics, including TW-800, the Waco tragedy, Oklahoma City, bombing, terrorism, covert government operations. And his speech tonight, his keynote speech, will be, Will the Rocket Engines Go the Way of the Dodos? Please help me welcome Mr. Jim Mars. Forward, it goes forward. You push it back, it goes back.
Mechanical things. All right. Howdy. Everybody having a good time? Yeah. What? Yeah. All right. Enough of that. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, and it's great. There's so many familiar faces here. I really feel like I'm kind of among friends, so that really helps because in another way, I'm a little bit antsy because I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. You folks, you're out there, you're studying, you're reading. You probably know about as much as I do, so what have I got to tell you? But I'm going to give it a shot, okay? A lot of times we get discouraged because we think, well, the government hasn't disclosed anything, and, and nobody really believes in this, and everybody all my neighbors and friends snicker at me because I talk about UFOs. But think how far we've come. Back in the 1950s, the burning question among UFO researchers was, do they come from Mars or do they come from Venus? Well, we got a little more sophisticated in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and the question became, well, do they come from Zeta Reticuli 4 or do they come from Alpha Centauri? Well, now it's the 2000s, And we're even more sophisticated. Now the question is, do they come from another planet? Do they come from another solar system? Do they come from another galaxy? Do they come from another dimension? Do they come from another time? And I'm here to tell you the answer is yes. Now, this is a downward look towards our own Milky Way galaxy, and as you can see, it's quite a stunning view. And do you notice that it's swirling? Do you know? We all know the solar system swirls around, okay? And we all know that the Earth spins on its axis. Why do it do that? And why don't we stop after some point? Something's going on. There's a force in the universe that we don't quite yet understand, but we're working on it. And that's kind of the topic of my talk tonight. And we're going to start with this fellow, David Hudson. David Hudson was, back in the 70s, mid-70s, was a farmer in Arizona. Now, don't get the idea that he just had a mule and a plow. This guy was a multi-million-dollar farmer, okay? But he was having a tough time of it because any of you who've been to Arizona, you realize that sun-baked soil is hard as concrete. How can you grow anything there? So he was putting sulfuric acid, trying to break up the soil, trying to get to where he could maybe make a living doing this big corporate farming thing. And when he did that, he began to see these little sparkly objects all around, and they picked it up, and there was these little tiny beads, okay? And he wasn't sure what that was. Along with the gold and silver, he was recovering something that they couldn't explain. And that something turned out to be something that was heretofore unknown to science. It was monatomic matter. And he found that by taking a cyanide solution and dissolving the gold, that some of it was gold, silver, platinum minerals, and that running it through a copper electrowinding cell that they would attach to a charcoal filter, and they would come out with these little small beads, but they still couldn't quite figure out what that was. So he coined the term ORME, which stands for Orbitally Rearranged Monatomic Elements, found in gold, silver, copper, cobalt, nickel, along with palladium, rhodium, iridium, ruthenium, osmium, and all that sort of stuff. Okay? Interestingly enough, ORME in ancient Hebrew meant, what is it? The tree of life. It meant the tree of life. So that's kind of interesting. But he also found that through a heating process that these beads, these monatomic elements, could be reduced to a fine white powder. And some of you, how many of you have heard of the white powder of gold? Okay, yeah, okay, several of you. So this is exactly what this was. But then keep in mind that you can also do this with silver and some of these platinum metals. I'm not going to go through all this, but here's just a brief handful of some of the scientific articles that have been, papers that have been published now, talking about this monatomic matter and the deformation of the atomic nuclei. Okay, we see super deformation of nuclei, super deformation in 104, 105 PD, and these are very, very sophisticated, cutting-edge papers. What we're finding out is, here we have the 1950s atom. This is Walt Disney's version, Our Friend the Atom, which if any of you all are my age or thereabout, this is what we were taught. Got a little nucleus and got your electrons buzzing all around. But over here on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see what the new, up-to-date Encyclopedia Britannica shows us about the atom. Whoa, it's a whole different animal now. And you'll notice that there is this cone, okay? Is this some sort of a swirling vortex that is around the atom? Because we all know that the atoms, the electrons, are all moving, okay? But what moves them? Why don't they stop? There's got to be some kind of, we're all told that perpetual motion is impossible, so what's pushing them? And we also see now that if you really get down and look at an atom, you've got the nucleus in the center, and then you've got your electrons moving around. But most of it is empty space. So now we're beginning to understand that the entire universe, everything we think is solid, like this podium, like not so solid, but my head, is not really solid at all. It's made up of atoms that's mostly empty space. So the whole universe is nothing but a big seething cauldron of energy. Okay? Now, if we could capture and harness that energy, we would begin to understand the basic makeup of the universe. They found that the nuclei of monatomic matter, under certain circumstances, could begin spinning. And it created oddly shaped forms. And as the nuclei begin to spin, they come apart. And then the deformation, as we just saw in some of the scientific papers. And Hudson says it's inherent in the stuff. There's not anything you can do from the outside. He sent some of this monatomic matter to Iowa State University, and they couldn't figure out what it was. They said, we don't know what it is. They sent it to Harwell Laboratories in England, and they couldn't figure out what it was. And it was finally, back in the 80s, the Soviet Academy of Sciences, because, hey, they're already always into far-out stuff, right? Psychic stuff and everything else. And they said this is monatomic elements. So in 1988, Hudson obtained 11 patents on this monatomic elements, or this orbitally rearranged monatomic elements. Now, as the nucleus begins to spin, and as you work with it, it can deform, and it tends to stretch out into a dumbbell shape, which I find very interesting because look how that approximates the centuries-old symbol for infinity. And we are now beginning to work with this because this is some information that was taken off the United Technologies website. And we find that as they're working with a fuel cell, which we all know will eventually replace gasoline, they said the electrolyte in the center allows only the protons to pass through the electrolyte to the cathode side of the fuel cell. But in other words, they are transmutating the atomic structure, and they are creating new energy technology. So this is not just far out stuff. We're on the cutting edge of science right now. But of course, you're not going to hear any of this on Fox News or CNN, right? Now it gets weirder. When they reduce these small granules of gold to a white powder, they placed the white powder on a scale, and they found that not only the powder, but the scale itself lost 44% of its original weight. Hey, this begins to sound like anti-gravity. Oh, we all know that's just a hoot. That doesn't exist. We can't talk about anti-gravity. If you're an academic and if you're a scientist, and unless you're just a stupid old dead-headed Texas reporter like me, you can't talk about anti-gravity because we all know that's just absurd. But here it is. Lost 44% of its weight. And it was transferable because the weighing pan lost 44% of its weight. But then it gets weirder. Through a heating process, it would disappear. Whoa! Wait a minute. Now, what we wouldn't give for an invisible airplane or an invisible tank. But they'd stir around in there and go, hey, what happened to it? And then as the cooling process progressed, the white powder would reappear, but it was not stirred up. It was in the original configuration. as when it was placed in the pan. So now we see, oh, it didn't just disappear, it went somewhere. But where? Another dimension, time, and that's another thing. What we're going to find is everything that we're trying to deal with, matter, speed, gravity, time, it's all connected because it's all connected to energy. And if you can nullify gravity, you're going to nullify time. If you can nullify time, you can nullify gravity. Hello? And now Hudson then went and talked to a local friend of his that was a rabbi and said, have you ever heard about the white powder of gold? And he immediately said, oh, yes. He said, but the knowledge of how to produce this was lost back at the time of the destruction of Solomon's temple. So this is, whoa, wait a minute. Maybe this is nothing new. Maybe this is some old technology, which then sends us on a checkup of all, of course, the alchemist, which up until, maybe the 19th century, that was their version of scientist. Encyclopedia Britannica states that the fabled philosopher's stone, often referred to as the elixir of life, is not really a stone anyway, but sometimes called a medicine for the rectification of base or sick metals. Irenaeus Philalethes, 17th century alchemist, wrote, our stone is nothing but gold digested to the highest degree of purity and subtle fixation. Whoa, so they were already onto this white powder of gold and this transmutation of base metals and palladium, platinum metals and gold and silver. But they had kind of lost the technique. They weren't sure how to make it work. So this, of course, we all know how the old alchemists were trying to convert base metals into gold. Okay, and they knew it could be done because the knowledge had been handed down, but they just had lost the techniques on how to do it. And notice how that the tree of life, okay, is also an integral part of all this. So we go back to the ancient literature, and we find in Ecclesiastes in the Bible it says what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. So, perhaps we're not discovering new technology. We are rediscovering old technology. Now, we go back to Exodus, and we find that when Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt and they wandered around in the desert for 40 years, how did they sustain themselves? Well, when the dew had gone up that was on the face of the wilderness, a fine flake-like thing, fine as hoarfrost on the ground. And when the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. So they would gather up this fine white powder, they'd mash it into little cakes, they'd bake it, and they'd eat it. And this was the manna from heaven. And manna in ancient Hebrew literally means, what is it? Because they didn't know what it was. Then we read, though, that they did understand that it had something to do with gold, that there was something mystical, something spiritual, magical about gold. So while Moses was up on the mountain obtaining the Ten Commandments, the Israelites took all their gold, melted it down, and created a golden calf, and they were worshiping it. And when Moses came down from the mountain and saw what they were doing, it really ticked him off. And he threw down the tablets and smashed them. By the way, do y'all realize that he smashed the original Ten Commandments? And later had to go back and say, God, I'm sorry I broke them. Would you give me some more? And he said, no, you're just going to have to make a copy. So we've only got the copy to go from today. But when Moses come down, he smashed the Ten Commandments. He saw what they were doing. He broke them at the foot of the mountain. And look what it says in Exodus. He took the calf, the golden calf, which they had made, and burnt it with fire and ground it to a powder and made the people of Israel drink it. Hello? Now, if you melt down gold and make somebody drink it, you're going to kill them. But it didn't say that. It said he burned it with fire, ground it to powder. Was this the monatomic white gold? It probably was, because you go further back and you find that the Egyptians had the shamana, or the maphus, or the manna, or the white powder of gold. We see that Ramesses the Great offers the conical white bread to the hawk-headed god Hathor. And we see that Amenhotep III receives the conical shamana. And in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, we find that as the pharaohs made each step of the 7 steps to the afterlife, they would stop and say, "What is it?" The same term they use for the manna. Mount Horeb, better known as the Mount of Moses, is located in the southern Sinai. And in 1904, the famed British archaeologist, easy for me to say, I can never say that even on a good day, Sir William Petrie discovered what he described as an ancient Egyptian temple on Mount Horeb, complete with a smelting facility. And as they were exploring, they pulled up the flagstones, and what did they find underneath? A great quantity of fine white powder. But they didn't know what it was, so they just left everything open, and the desert winds blew it all away, okay? This is 1904. I have not been to Mount Horeb myself, but you can see in the backgrounds a mountain range. And I have talked to some people who have been there, and they said the guides and the Egyptians at that point was telling them that in these mountains, very nearby within sight, are ancient gold mining operations. So is this where Moses was making the white powder of gold, which he then strewed on the ground and said, "This is the manna from heaven"? But where did that knowledge come from? We all know that all the roads lead to Sumer, the Sumerian civilization, the world's truly first civilization. And when I say that, we find that it's really interesting, but that we actually can know more about the ancient Sumerians than we'll ever know about the Egyptians, or even the Romans for that matter, because they wrote all their records for the most part on papyrus and paper, and this disintegrates and it goes away. The ancient Sumerians used the little stylus to put cuneiform onto clay tablets, and then they were baked, turned to stone, and there's 500,000 of them still existent in the world. We also know that knowledge of the ancient Sumerians came from Sumeria to Egypt, primarily, but not exclusively, but primarily by the biblical patriarch Abraham. And I find it really, really fascinating to realize that both the Arabs and the Jews looked to Abraham as their forefather, their patriarch, which means that these Palestinians and these Arabs and these Jews who are fighting each other to the death over in the Middle East are all blood relatives. Okay? Why can't we just learn to get along? The Sumerians were really ahead of their time, or they're ahead of our time. Maybe both. You notice on this Sumerian relief, they correctly depict the number and the relative size of our solar system. And yet we know that Uranus was not known to modern man until 1781, Neptune in 1846, and Pluto in 1930. So how do they know about all this? We also know that we owe our geometry and our modern timekeeping systems to the Sumerian base 60 mathematical system. The modern zodiac was a Sumerian creation based on their 12, quote, gods, and they used it to chart a great precessional cycle, the division of the 360-degree view from the Earth's North Pole during its 12-month orbit around the Sun into 12 equal parts or houses of 30 degrees each. and taking into account the slight wobble in the Earth's orbit, movement through this complete cycle takes 25,920 years. So how could the Sumerians, whose civilization, we're told, only lasted about 2,000 years, possibly have observed and recorded a celestial cycle that took 25,920 years to complete? We also know they had lots of other good stuff. They came up with the first laws. They came up with the first courts legal system. They came up with the world's first language. And they came up with electricity, the Baghdad battery. This only goes back to 220 B.C., but then they didn't know what it was for a long time until somebody thought to put some grape juice in the container, put the cylinder down through there, and put the copper down through the middle, and whoa, they produced a half a volt of electricity. So maybe they weren't quite as backward as we tend to think they were. And how do we know all this stuff? Because, again, they put it on their baked tablets, which are still in existence. 500,000 of them scattered around the museums of the world, and only 20% of them have been translated. And they predate the Bible by at least 4,000 years. Any of you young people out there, if you're thinking, what am I going to do with my life? Please, learn Sumerian and go translate those tablets. Maybe we'll find out what's going on. All of human history has resided in the museums in Mesopotamia, Chaldea, okay, all of which is today modern Iraq. That's where it all started. That's where all the secrets are. And what are the secrets? The tablets even tell us where we came from, what's happening, or at least one significant portion of what happened here in the Earth's far distant past. They tell us that 432,000 years ago, before the Great Flood, the Anunnaki, which has been translated as those who came from the heavens down to the earth, came through the Great Bracelet, it's the asteroid belt, and they landed in the Persian Gulf. And they began to colonize and search for gold. They were after gold. And there were strikes over the hard work, and it was decided to engineer a slave race by manipulating the DNA of primitives. Now, by the way, this is really fascinating to me because they had the same arguments that we're having today about the propriety of cloning and changing genetic sequences, etc., etc. But they really needed the gold. So they rationalized and said, well, okay, we're not really creating anything because that's God's purview. We are simply making better an existing primitive race. All right? And their science officer, Enki, said, hey, we don't have to have all this strife because I've been working with some primitive earth creatures down in the Abzug, which has been translated to mean Africa, and I've got a little lab down there, and I've been working with these things, and I think I can tweak their DNA, and I think we can come up with a servant race that will do all this hard gold mining for us, and then we won't have to worry about the Anunnaki having strikes and work slowdowns and everything else because they don't like all that harsh conditions down there digging for gold. And they went along with it. Now, science today tells us that the microchronal DNA can be traced all the way back to one female in Africa. Shall we call her Lucy? Okay. And the Sumerian tablets even give a description on how they did this. They took the sperm of an Anunnaki male and they fertilized the egg of a earth primitive female, and then they implanted the fertilized egg in the womb of an Anunnaki female who carried it to term and had a cesarean birth, okay, and produced what they call the Adama, the Adam, the first human, okay, the earth human. And then after that, things went to hell in a handbasket because pretty soon the humans were overrunning everything. the overall mission commander, Enlil, complained, according to the tablets, about he was kept awake at night by all the humans having sex. You know? Keep them quiet. Keep them out of here. Get them out of the house. And pretty soon, they decided they didn't want to have direct contact with the humans, so they set up a system of kingship, which came about also because some of them decided that these earth females weren't too bad. And so they were messing around with them, and we came out with the hybrids. In the Genesis book of the Old Testament, they call them the Nephilim. The sons of God who mated with the earth women. All right? And they were the mighty men of yore because they were hybrids. One of these hybrids, according to legend, was the great king of the Sumerians, Gilgamesh. And you really ought to go back and read the story of Gilgamesh. It's quite a saga, and it has not received the same publicity as the Odyssey of Homer and some of the other great heroes. But basically, Gilgamesh, who said that his parents, one of his parents was of the gods and his other parents was of the earth, and so he was a hybrid, he was half and half, and he wanted to know the secret of immortality. He didn't want to live a mortal lifespan. He wanted a little bit more, which indicates, why would he want that unless he knew that there was more to be had? So he takes off with his non-human companion Enkidu, and that's a real question. Was Enkidu some sort of organic robot? Was he a metal robot? Was he a Robbie the robot? You know, or was he maybe just a very primitive earth creature? And that may be it, because Enkidu, when he starts out, is on all fours, baying at the moon, scratching behind his ears, and drinking with his mouth from puddles. And Gilgamesh shapes him up, puts him in clothes, teaches him a language, and pretty soon he's going along with him. Now, for the longest time, we thought that Gilgamesh was just some kind of legend, just, you know. And it's the same thing with this Anunnaki, by the way. The Sumerian tablets never refer to them as gods. They just refer to them as the Anunnaki. It was only in the 19th century, the mid-1800s, that archaeologists began digging up all these mounds over in Iraq, and they began to uncover these ancient Sumerian cities. And it was only at that time they began to understand that there was a civilization older than Egypt. Before that, everybody in the world, the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, all the way up to our written history, they thought the first great civilization was Egypt. And that's why a lot of people today still think Egypt was a big civilization. But no, it was the Sumerians. And so it was only those folks, those translators in the 1800s, who were reading about these Anunnaki who could fly through the air, who could shoot bolts and blow up whole cities, and who could do all this wondrous stuff. It didn't make any sense to them because they didn't have a clue about faster than, flight, heavier than air flight, or gene splicing, cloning. They didn't have a clue about that, so they just said, well, this is their mythology. These are their gods. And if you want to read about Enki and Enkidu and all this bunch, go look at Encyclopedia Britannica, and you'll find the whole story right there, except it's under Sumerian mythology. Okay? And so what's happening today, really, starting with Zachariah Sitchin and Dr. David Horn and C.L. Turnage and, I don't know, a whole bunch of people, is they're not really retranslating anything. The translations have all stayed pretty much the same. It's the mindset. They've clicked a little bit, and they're saying, look, these stories that they were telling that back in the 1800s, early 1900s, we said was their mythology, are actually their history, and they're telling us real stuff. Okay? That's the only thing that's happening, and it's slowly seeping along. Some of you are familiar with this, some of you are not, some of you buy into it, some of you don't. That's okay. It's trickle down. It's working. We also know that Saddam Hussein believed himself to be the reincarnated King Nebuchadnezzar. and that he was rebuilding Babylon. So obviously he had an intense interest in this ancient history. And he probably knew all about the Anunnaki, and he knew all this, quote, mythology. So it would actually behoove us to consider a little bit the story of King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, which was just another name, and that's another thing they've thrown us off with all this time. They talk about Samaria, and then it's Chaldea, and then it's Assyria, and then it's, the Babylonians. And, hey, it's all the same bunch from the same place. It's all over there in what is now Iraq. And King Nebuchadnezzar also believed himself a hybrid, a mixture, part God, part human. And he, too, was interested in finding out the secrets of longevity. And I'll stop and mention right here how the secrets of longevity tie in with the monatomic gold and the powder of gold, is that there is some theory and some work being done that the white powder of gold, if ingested, does more than heal you. It actually cleans up your DNA. Now, that's really thought-provoking, because we all know that every 7 years, every cell in your body has been renewed. Okay? Any of you who are older than 7 years old, 7 years ago, there's not one cell in your body today that was there 7 years ago, because your DNA tells that strands within each cell says replicate the cell, and it replicates. I was kind of amazed to find out that if you got a ugly scar on your arm, the DNA tells it replicate the cell, not a healed cell, but replicate the cell of the scar. That's why your scar's still there. Okay? So we also know that at the end of the DNA chain, or what they call the telomerase caps, and at a certain point in your life, these caps kick in and say, okay, that's it, stop replicating the cell. And when that happens, oxidation sets in, and you grow old, and you die. Now, theoretically, if we could do away with the telomerase caps, then theoretically, your DNA would continue to tell your cells, keep replicating, and we could live to be 800, 900, 1,000 years old. Whoa! Think about that. Back in Baptist Bible school, when they told me about Methuselah and he lived to be 850 years old, I went, don't give me a break. Nobody lives that old. But maybe they did, because they had the secrets of the white powder. And maybe they ingested the right strength and the right quantity and over a right period of time, and maybe they did live to be 800,000 years old. And we could too, if it wasn't for the fact that the pharmaceutical corporations are making too much money selling us all these painkillers, okay? But back to King Nebuchadnezzar. He also understood the mystical power of gold and the manipulation of energy that can be done. We all know that gold is one of the best conductors that there is. So he built an edifice. And in the Bible, it gives you all the specifications. Sounds like a big outhouse, basically. But he built it out of gold. Now, in the garbled translations that have come down to us, as various and sundry peoples and centuries have translated the Bible, it comes out to be a fiery furnace. But obviously it was not, because he put people in there and had people working on it. But of course, some of his people died. So it was creating an electromagnetic field within here, something very akin to the Ark of the Covenant, which carried with it an electromagnetic field. And if you went up and touched it, you died. So there was some really powerful stuff going on back there. How did they build the Great Pyramids? Maybe they had the manipulation of energy secrets, and they simply lifted those things up and transported them around. We don't know, but we have this tantalizing evidence that way back there, the vestiges of this knowledge of the manipulation of energy at the atomic and subatomic level was known at least to some of these people. So Nebuchadnezzar would send his people in there and they'd die, and it was really aggravating him. So he goes to Palestine overruns that place and grabs 3 of the top Hebrew priests, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, brings them up there, and he says, okay, I want you to make this thing work, because they had the knowledge passed down from Abraham that he had brought from Ur of the Chaldees, which is the city of Ur in Iraq. And they said, well, you're not our king. You don't worship our God. We're not going to work for you. So he said, okay, then I'm going to throw you in there, and you're either going to make it work or you're going to die. But he didn't just chunk them in. First, it says they donned their hats, their coats, and their garments. Well, now, why did they make mention of that, and why would he let them put stuff on if they were just going to throw them in a fiery furnace? Was it their radiation suits? And then when they're in there, he calls to his minions. He said, he didn't want to get close to it. He said, are they in there? And they said, oh, yes, O king, they're in there. Are they alive? Yeah, they're walking around in there. In fact, there's 4 of them. 4 of them? We only put 3 of them in there. Where'd the 4th one come from? Who's the 4th one? Oh, king, it's the Son of God. That's what it says right there in the Bible, and then that's the last you hear of that. I'd like to know who that was. Who was the Son of God? Where'd he come from? And where'd he go to? Is that tantalizing evidence that by manipulating this energy, they were creating a stargate or a portal, another dimensional gate? Somebody came through, because they put 3 in, and all of a sudden there's 4. Now we come up to modern day, and we find that all of these secrets lay buried for thousands of years in Iraq. And in 2000, 2001, 2002, French and German archaeology teams, according to ABC News and the Associated Press, were making incredible and amazing new discoveries in Iraq. Whoa, what kind of amazing discoveries? Well, there was all kinds of things, additional tablets, steels, and they even specifically mentioned weapons. Well, why would they mention weapons? Who cares about an old rusty spear or a sword? Maybe there was something else more involved. And right after that, George Bush decides we've got to attack Iraq. Never mind that the United Nations weapons inspector, Hans Blick, said there is no weapons of mass destruction there. Never mind that our own weapons inspector, Scott Ritter, said there is no weapons of mass destruction there. And never mind that the International Atomic Energy Agency said they do not have weapons of mass destruction. And never mind that there were anti-war demonstrations in most American cities at levels even greater than at the height of the anti-Vietnam War. Never mind all that. We got to invade Iraq. Based on lies, of course, as we all now know. And so they attacked Iraq. Now, did they follow normal, standard, go by the book, military tactics, which says you attack an objective, you seize your objective, you consolidate the countryside and your winnings, and then you move on to your next objective? No. We made a beeline for Baghdad, bypassing the whole countryside, which is now causing us all kind of problems because we failed to pacify the countryside. Now, once we got to Baghdad, what happened? Well, we immediately guarded the Ministry of Oil. But despite warnings and pleas from museum directors around the world who went to the Pentagon in early 2003 and got assurances that they would protect the human resources and heritage in the Iraqi National Museum, it was looted and virtually destroyed by a gang of looters. Which sounds terrible, except if you really study it, you find that there were a few hundred looters and there were several thousand Iraqis outside yelling and screaming, saying, don't do this. Please don't do this. This is our heritage. And there was something very peculiar about the looting. 170,000 items were taken out of this museum. But the looters had glass cutters that were not commercially available in Iraq. They had keys to some of the vaults. Some of the guards were suspiciously missing, and some of the locked areas were suspiciously unlocked. Okay? And the key thing to me is they bypassed very expensive-looking fakes. They knew what they were after. And they tore into everything, opened up the strong boxes, the vaults, made a mess of the whole thing. At one point, one of the museum officials was able to gather a handful of U.S. soldiers and brought them there, and they fired their weapons in the air, and they actually began to disperse this mob, this looters, probably a hired mob, for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then they were ordered to pull out, and the looters returned. Colonel Matthew Bagdanos, Deputy Director of the Joint Interagency Coordination Group, at the direction of General Tommy Franks, investigated the looting of the Iraqi National Museum. And as we all know, many of the more common exhibits that were taken out of the ground floors and some of the upper floors, they've been found at the bazaars and on the black market, and a lot of those have been returned. But Colonel Bagdanos says the basement is what we've been calling the inside job. And I'll say it forever like a mantra. It is inconceivable to me that the basement was breached and the items stolen without an intimate knowledge of the museum. From there, about 10,000 pieces were taken, and we've only recovered 650 approximately. Now, what was in the basement? All the newly discovered, amazing discoveries found in Iraq by French and German archaeology teams, which, interestingly enough, those were the two countries that most opposed our invasion of Iraq. Okay? So that's exactly where you would take newly discovered items that had not been cataloged or prepared for exhibition. Were they after the secrets of the white powder, the transmutation of energy at the atomic and subatomic level? Well, they're not the only ones. Back during World War II, we all know the Germans made spectacular leaps in technology. They had the world's first jet fighter, the Messerschmitt 262. They came up with the first rockets, the V-1, the V-2. And the guy in charge of all this is the only known photograph of SS General Hans Kammler. And as the war grew on, Albert Speer, the defense minister armaments minister of Germany, began to complain quite loudly in post-war books that the top secret technology being developed by the Germans was taken away from him and placed under Heinrich Himmler and his SS. The SS began to assume control over all of the super secret and highly technological weaponry that was being developed, and General Hans Kammler was in charge. It was General Hans Kammler who ordered, after a bombing raid on Peenemünde, ordered the V-2 rocket program moved to southern Bavaria and took Werner von Braun and General Dornberger and all of the guys that were working on this rocket science, and he took them down to the relative safety of southern Bavaria. While he was there, von Braun has written that he asked Kammler if they couldn't get back into the experimentation. He wanted to get on with his rocket work. And Kammler told him, I am going to turn you and the rockets over to the Americans in exchange for immunity. That was his ace in the hole that he was going to play with the Allies. And yet it didn't happen. Kammler disappeared. And when the Allied armies, Patton's army, overran Bavaria, they scooped up Werner von Braun, Dornberger, and the V-2 programs, V-1 programs, and that's how we got the rocket science. But yet there are persistent rumors that Hans Kammler was seen in the United States walking around freely after the war. So what did he give to the Americans to guarantee his immunity? Was it the Nazi flying saucers, which are a historical fact? They found the diagrams and the specifications for flying saucers, electromagnetically powered, on the drawing boards. The only question is, did they actually build some working models, or was all this theory? They also had 3-stage rockets on the drawing board. And there's not much doubt what they planned to use with those, because one of them was designated the New York rocket. Another one was designated the Mars rocket. Ooh, wonder if they're after me. But there it all was. Okay? But that was all still on the drawing boards. What did Hans Kammler give them? Well, if any of you have read Nick Cook's book, In Search of the Zero Point, you realize that he was taken to some Nazi ruins at Ludwigsdorf, Poland, and it appears that they either did or were trying to construct a super collider superconductor. So they were working with this basic energy manipulation, something far and above the primitive rocket science. Now, most of you are familiar with General Twining's memo of September the 23rd, 47, and we always focus on this paragraph A, which says the phenomena, and up here the subject is flying disc. The phenomena reported something real and not visionary or fictitious. We knew in 1947 that saucers were real and that this was not fictitious. Others knew it too. This is a diagram of a fourth-dimensional vehicle designed and patented in 1957, but with patents that dated back to 1947 by a fellow named Otis T. Carr, Baltimore, Maryland. In his brochure of his company, the Curato Dynamics, they were introducing the Curato gravity motor. And in 57, in this brochure, he claimed the total answer for space travel is, quote, any vehicle accelerated to an axis rotation relative to its attractive inertial mass immediately becomes activated by free space energy and acts as an independent force. Oh, free space energy. That kind of sounds like 0-point energy, doesn't it? And he's talking about a rotating force. So what happened to Mr. Carr? The U.S. government came down on him, squished him, called him a crackpot, ran him off, just like they did Wilhelm Reich, Tesla, Royal Raymond Rife, Tucker, you name them. You come up with something good. If they can't classify it as a national security secret, then they send in the Security and Exchange Commission, the IRS, and the EPA and everybody else, and they just wreck you. But he wasn't the only one. At this time, we see that there were magazine articles talking about the G engines are coming. We're going to develop a gravity engines. L.D. Bell, aviation pioneer, says we're already working on nuclear fuels and equipment to cancel out gravity. And Bill Lear, designer of the Learjet, says all matter within these new ships would be influenced by the ship's gravitation only. All right? And the British, right after the war, were announcing that they were going to produce a whole new revolutionary type of aircraft that could travel 18,000 miles an hour and turn on a dime, and sounds like UFO. Okay? And they went into business and they set up a plant in Western Canada, and before long, the United States was involved by the early 50s, and that's where we got the Avro car, okay, which was a saucer-shaped device. And again, going back to Twining's memo, in 1947, he also stated that it is possible within the present U.S. knowledge, provided extensive detailed development is undertaken, to construct a piloted aircraft which has the general description of the object in paragraph A, which was the flying disc. So in 47, Twining, head of the Air Material Command, said, yeah, if we have a concerted effort like the Manhattan Project, we can build a flying saucer. Okay, and then you've got all these people in the early 50s saying, oh, yeah, we can make this and we can make that, and you have the Avro car, and then the curtain of black dropped. And from that point on, anybody who tries to talk about anti-gravity is laughed out of the room. It became a dark and a non-subject. But the question is, was it really? In 1959, they finally rolled out this Avro car, and it wobbled around a little bit, and they said, nah, we really couldn't make it work. And that was the end of that. So was that really the end of it? Interesting enough, in June 1947, we've got the famous Kenneth Arnold incident where he saw the disc over Mount Rainier. And where they go to? They all flew back north towards western Canada, exactly where the Avro plant was located. I recently found these pictures on the internet. Here seems to be a U.S. Air Force flying saucer flying around. Back in the early 60s, you notice it's going down the little picture. It's flying along with the Sabre jet. What powered it? Was this jets? Was it magnetics? Was it anti-gravity? Well, we don't know because it's all in the dark hole of national security. But now, today, there is a group of scientists, businessmen, military people who have taken upon themselves to penetrate the secrets of UFO technology. And they now have a pretty good idea of the technology being used and are quietly seeking funding to see if they just can't build one on their own. But they hesitate on this because they realize or they believe that this would be a duplication of effort. Because there's an abundance of evidence, which I don't even have to go into with you folks. Area 51, things go up, zip, zip, zip. Okay? That this technology is already in existence and in the hands of, I hesitate to say the United States government because, as we all know, there are circles within the circles. But within people connected to the government and or military, they have this technology. And why duplicate the effort and spend millions on prototypes when they've already got some working? This group feels like that they need to increase public awareness and they need to find the leverage to force the people within the government who we can describe as MJ-12, if that's indeed what they still are calling themselves, into giving us this technology. Because we all know that the basic human needs are food, clothing, and shelter. But I submit to you that there is a more basic need, and that is energy. If you have energy, you can plow fields and you can produce food. If you have energy, you can make clothing. If you have energy, you can build houses. Energy is the key. And right now, we're choking to death on the fumes of petrochemicals. With the current levels of pollution, ice cap melting, geophysical changes that are taking place on the planet, the time for such secrets being held in the hands of a self-appointed few is past. The population of the earth must begin to take our future into our own hands. Now, what they're finding out is that, as we all probably figured out, flying saucers, UFOs, operate on the manipulation of energy with a spinning vortex and the distortion of space that accompanies a craft trying to move. In this diagram, we see one produced by Miguel Alcubierre, who says this is what the space around a traveling craft would look like. We can also see in this diagram that you have a series of electromagnetic fields based on vortices, which then can propel and guide your basic UFO. And here we see how it works. You've got your hover mode, and when you shift the field, then that propels a craft. We also know now that if you can shift the basic energy at the atomic, subatomic level, that you can nullify not only gravity, but time. We all know the time factor in the UFO narratives. Missing time, people going, Travis Walton, gone for several days, but to him it didn't seem like that long. We've all heard this. We know there's a time distortion involved. One of my favorite stories is an account taken in 1897. Last year, for those of you who are here, discussed the Aurora spaceship crash. And the fourth record was an account by a railroad track inspector who went off and got towards the end of the day. It was getting dark. He started to turn around and go home. He saw a bright light up ahead. So he went up to investigate, and he found a large silver cigar-shaped object sitting on the tracks with a bunch of little crewmen around in little blue uniforms. Well, he didn't know any better, so he went up to see what was going on, and the captain of the ship told him, please don't tell anybody about seeing us here. You know, you got to keep this secret. He says, we're on a secret mission. This was in the spring of 1897. He says, we're on our way to bomb Havana. Well, the only problem here, folks, is the Spanish-American War did not begin until the spring of a year later, 1898, when the battleship Maine blew up in Havana Harbor, and William Randolph Hearst, said, I'll create a war, and we went to war with Spain and fought in Cuba, and Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Riders, and all that good stuff. They knew what was going to happen, but they were a year too early in telling this fellow. Time, space, gravity, when you get to energy manipulation, it's meaningless. And this is the big problem with physics, mathematics, all your scientists, because they're still trying to work it out with a pencil. And it doesn't work out, because once you nullify gravity, time, space, matter, all of the computations are out the window. But we are working on that, and we'll continue to work on that, and we're learning all the time. Now, if all of this seems to be over your head, I prepared this little diagram. It's very clear, very concise, very simple. This will give you the interspatial displacement temporal gravimeter. All you have to do is take a look at this, and you'll understand it completely. This is the way it works. And that's a little joke, but very little. But it also shows that perception can be deceived. Things are not always as they appear to be. And we now know that we could create a device like this that could actually work just like a flying saucer can. And we have to ask ourselves, when we hear all these reports of these hovering triangles, are they them or are they us? Human ingenuity, reverse engineering, and are we getting our future technology from the past? But there are many hurdles and many challenges ahead, none the least of which, here are 7 questions that I put for you, and I'll leave up here for a while. Until we can answer clearly questions such as this to ourselves, then we are probably not ready to go into the future of science and energy manipulation that is waiting for us if we'll only grow up and take the chance. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all tonight. Thank you very much. Let's party.